Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week of Maeglin and Man, as we cover through to the end of Chapter 17 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, an ambitious venture that we're going to try to accomplish, or at least get as close as we can in the next 90 to 100 minutes. It is the first 90-degree day of the year here in the great state of Oklahoma, and I just want you to know how much I appreciate spending this Sunday afternoon with you here in my own little dark cave, not unlike, the ancient boughs of Nan Elmoth sitting here beneath the starlit sky here in the middle of the afternoon, rather than being, for example, by the pool, a thing that some other people are probably doing right now. But not me. I'm here with you discussing the works of Professor Tolkien. Last time we established the geography and, just as importantly, if not far more importantly, the new political status quo of Beleriand, including the construction of the two great hidden elven cities, Nargothrond, built by Finrod Felagund, on the river Narog in West Beleriand, inspired by Menegroth in Doriath, of course, and by Gondolin, built by Turgon, northwest of Menegroth, in the hidden valley revealed by Ulmo. Glad Rebecca's joining me here in the chat, and Glorfin David will show up soon. That's good to know, Becky. Good to have you with us this Sunday afternoon. So we established last week that the Sons of Feanor are helping to man the siege of Angband, right? All of the Noldor returned from Valinor are beleaguering Angband and Morgoth at this point. We've got... it's so complicated to lay it out. Even here, I have encapsulated it for myself in my notes, and I'm still having trouble, conceptualizing geographically how this whole thing works. It's almost as though we didn't need to spend any time on that chapter at all. Feanor's sons are manning the siege in the east, the northeast of Beleriand. We've got Doriath in central Beleriand under Thingol and Melian, of course. We've got the sons of Finarfin under Finrod in western Beleriand and Fingolfin in the northwest. We then moved on to see Galadriel confessing some part of the coming of the Noldor to Beleriand to Melian, who then brought her husband King Thingol up to speed, including telling him about the death of his friend Finwë at Formenos at the hands of Morgoth. And you'll remember, I'm sure, that it was Thingol's friendship with Finwë way back when, before anyone went across to Valinor, that justified him traveling hither and yon in Beleriand. It was Elwë's then, Elwë's now Thingol's friendship with Finwë that led him to the forest of Nan Elmoth in the first place and led him into the arms of Melian, who is now his queen. So that friendship has been long established, well established, though it's true that Thingol has not heard anything of his friend for 3,500 years by this point. So we're going to pick up immediately with the end of chapter 15 with this with the aftermath of Galadriel's exposition to Melian and Melian's exposition to Thingol here with this slide. Let me call this up. Then Thingol was silent, being filled with grief and foreboding, but at length he said, "Now at last I understand the coming of the Noldor out of the west, of which I wondered much before. Not to our aid did they come, save by chance. For those that remain in Middle-earth, the Valar will leave to their own devices until the uttermost need. For vengeance and redress of their loss the Noldor came. Yet all the more sure shall they be as allies against Morgoth, with whom it is not now to be thought that they shall ever make treaty." But Melian said, "Truly for these causes they came, but for others also. Beware of the sons of Feanor. The shadow of the wrath of the Valar lies upon them, and they have done evil, I perceive, both in Aman and to their own kin. A grief but lulled to sleep lies between the princes of the Noldor." And Thingol answered, "What is that to me? Of Feanor I have heard but report, which makes him great indeed. Of his sons I hear little to my pleasure, yet they are likely to prove the deadliest foes of our foe." "Their swords and their counsels shall have two edges," said Melian, and afterwards they spoke no more on the matter. So let's note something important here, I suppose. First, Thingol, who went into the West back when he was called Elwë, right? Back before he met Melian, he was one of the ambassadorial team that was sent over to Valinor in the first place. He still has faith in the Valar. He still believes that they have the best intentions of the elves at heart, which is not to say that he is incorrect, right? I'm not positioning him as an outlier here because he's wrong. I'm positioning him as an outlier here because, unlike the Noldor, he still has this true and original faith in the Valar, and unlike the other Sindar, he has met them himself. He met Ulmo. He's presumably met Manwë. He presumably fist-bumped Tukas. He knows what's up. And he's been elevated in both his physical stature and in his wisdom by his marriage to Melian, of course. So he is as I've said before, the only of the Calaquendi still among the Sindar. Karen is joining us here. Oh, Karina is joining us. Hi, Karina, joining us here live in the chat. Good to have you with us. I know it's late where you are. I'm glad that you could make it for at least the beginning of this week's session. So Thingol looks at the situation here, still with his faith in the Valar, and notes, the Noldor aren't what we thought. Okay, but at least in their desire for vengeance, they will be good allies to us in the war against Morgoth. Melian counsels him that the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend, which is an extension, I think, of the same kind of philosophy of purpose that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, right? Because in a universe ordered to be ultimately good by a benevolent god, the Tolkienian universe, the morality of any given action can only be determined by the intent of the actor. This is what we talked about previously. So similarly, political pragmatism, it doesn't shortcut ill intent by preventing a greater evil, because evil always turns to good. So right here, and I'm emphasizing this right here because it is going to be our recurring beat through to the end of this chapter, we're seeing an imperfect wisdom from Thingol, an acknowledgement, right, of the power of the Valar and the ultimate goodness to which Arda will be turned, but also this stain of pragmatism, this willingness to compromise on principle because of practicality. And that, my dear Silmarillion heirs, is, in Tolkien's worldview, I think, the beginning of the slippery slope to evil. Why not practically, pragmatically, as Boromir suggests, use the ring against the foe? Because once you compromise your principles, which is where the morality lives, then you're sunk. This is Mandos and his "and yet remain evil." We are here to understand, I think, that Thingol may not want to take up arms against the Noldor, right? He has understood that they have come with this ill intent, right? And as Melian is warning him, but there's more besides, right? Beware the sons of Fëanor, the shadow of the wrath of the Valar lies upon them, and they have done evil, I perceive, both in Aman and to their own king. And Thingol is answering practically. He's answering, we might say, I'm not 100% sure that I would go down this road, but we might say that he's answering as a just and wise and cautious king ought at this point, because, yeah, the Noldor may be bad news. The Sons of Fëanor, in particular, may be bad news, but you know where they are right now? They are between us and Morgoth. They have taken the most accessible routes from Angband down into Beleriand itself, certainly the most accessible routes from Angband down into Doriath, and they are kind of this bulwark against the might of the foe, so maybe we compromise our principles just a little bit. Maybe we treat with these shared enemies of our enemy. Which is, as I say, complicated because we have to maintain this understanding of wherein the morality of any given action can be found, right? It is the clarity of your intent that determines what is good and what is bad in a world in which ultimately everything is going to turn out to be good. Let's move on here and get to the first confrontation with the king. It was not long before whispered tales began to pass among the Sindar concerning the deeds of the Noldor ere they came to Beleriand. Certain it is whence they came, and the evil truth was enhanced and poisoned by lies, but the Sindar were yet unwary and trustful of words, and, as may well be thought, Morgoth chose them for this first assault of his malice, for they knew him not. And Círdan, hearing these dark tales, was troubled, for he was wise, and perceived swiftly that true or false they were put about at this time through malice, though the malice he deemed was that of the princes of the Noldor, because of the jealousy of their houses. Therefore he sent messengers to Thingol to tell him all that he had heard. It chanced that at that time the sons of Finarfin were again the guests of Thingol, for they wished to see their sister Galadriel. Then Thingol, being greatly moved, spoke in anger to Finrod, saying, ill have you done me, kinsman, to conceal so great matters from me, for now I have learned of all the evil deeds of the Noldor. But Finrod answered, what ill have I done you, lord? What evil deed have the Noldor done in all your realm to grieve you? Neither against your kinship, nor against any of your people have they thought evil or done evil. I marvel at you, son of Eowyn, said Thingol, that you would come to the board of your kinsmen thus red-handed from the slaying of your mother's kin, and yet say naught in defence, nor yet seek any pardon. So, the lies of Morgoth once more going forth, right? There are these whispered tales of exactly what it was that the Noldor did. This is the part that Galadriel, as you'll recall, will not speak of. This is the part that Galadriel will not reveal to even Melian in that discourse out there in the garden in Doriath. But the stories start coming, and they are immediately enhanced and poisoned by lies, as the slide says there, right? But the Sindar were yet unwary and trustful of words, and as may well be thought, Morgoth chose them for this first assault of his malice, for they knew him not. So the Sindar haven't been through this before. The Noldor have, of course. The first tainting of the Noldor, the first twisting of the Noldor came from exactly this kind of propaganda campaign back in Valinor following the release of Morgoth from his long imprisonment. But the Sindar haven't been down this road. As far as they're concerned, Morgoth is just this shadow on the hills above Cuivanen that takes those elves that stray too far from home. He's this boogeyman out there in the night. He's this architect of the first war of Beleriand, the first battles that they have fought. He's the force behind the orcs, yes, but they haven't tangled with his subtlety yet, with his craftiness yet. So he goes forth and twists the truth, enhanced and poisoned by lies, made worse. Not completely fabricated, because lies which are completely fabricated are so trivially discovered, right? But if you can just put a little English on the ball, if you can just spin it just so, then you can turn and manipulate the recipients of these lies to your own intent. And here we have a prime example of that, right? Círdan the shipwright, down there on the southwestern coast of Beleriand, he hears these dark tales and is troubled, for he was wise and perceived swiftly that true or false, they were put about at this time through malice. So he understands, because he is wise in this moment, that the only reason he's hearing the stories is because someone out there has malicious intent. But Círdan's wisdom is incomplete. It is insufficient in this moment, because he does understand that these are lies. He does understand that this is a propaganda campaign, or that these are exaggerated tales at least. He does understand that they are coming to him because someone wants him to do something, but he attributes the spreading of these stories not to Morgoth, because he's never dealt with this side of Morgoth, but rather to the princes of the Noldor themselves, because of the jealousy of their houses, right? The friction between the sons of the sons of the three sons of Finwë, I guess. Therefore, he sends messengers to Thingol to tell him all that he's heard, and Thingol calls out Finrod, who is there visiting Galadriel in Doriath. "Ill have you done to me, kinsman, to conceal so great matters from me, for now I have learned of all the evil deeds of the Noldor." Asterisk, or at least those evil deeds that Círdan has heard of from people who are basically being twisted by Morgoth into telling these stories in the first place. And Finrod answers, again, kind of walking the line that Galadriel was walking, right? "What ill have I done you, Lord? Of what evil deed have the Noldor done in all your realm to grieve you?" Answer, none. Since we got here, in case you're wondering, since we set foot on this shore, we haven't done anything wrong at all. Neither against your kingship nor against any of your people have they thought evil or done evil. We haven't committed any crimes. We haven't even thought about committing any crimes to you and yours. This is, an incomplete answer from Finrod once again. And Thingol calls it out here, right? Putting the twist here on the fact that Finrod and the sons of Finarfin are the sons of Eärwen. That's the daughter of Olwe, right? The Swan Maiden of Alqualonde. Thingol's niece, in fact, at this. That's the relationship that we've got here. So we're getting all of this half-truth and kind of the sparring, the interaction, the meshing of the gears of these different variants on the stories, and this will only spin to evil. This is, of course, part of the doom of the Noldor. This is the shadow that we must always remember as we move through this chapter, and certainly the next chapter too, is the aspect of the doom of the Noldor that prophesies, that predicts, that foreshadows treason and the fear of treason, right? There will be dissent among the Noldor forever because they can't trust each other and they can't even trust themselves. These disparate houses, right? This is reflected, I think. I had some email conversations about the founding of Gondolin in the wake of last week's episode. And the fact that I'm clearly a little unsure whether or not the founding of Gondolin is a good thing. And I myself don't know entirely how to reconcile that, because I don't think that the founding of Gondolin is compatible with the vision for elves that we have been given previously, right? This is not the best world for the elves. They ought not to live in Gondolin. They ought not to live in Nargothrond. They ought not really to live in Doriath, though Doriath's kind of a different example, because there they are bounded not artificially, but magically, right? It's the girdle of Melian that protects Doriath from the scourge of Morgoth and his beasts. And that this is just not what elves were intended for, right? This was not the purpose of the creation of the children of Iluvatar in the first place, was to live in these guarded spaces. But I have to concede, it's Ulmo who carries the news of Gondolin to Turgon. It's Ulmo who suggests the construction of these fortresses. And I don't know what to make of what I take to be bad advice coming from one of the Valar at all, period, right? But specifically Olmo, who is possessed of this wisdom because he hears all the news and the stories and the gossip that comes from Middle-earth. He hears it in the water. So I've had a couple of discussions this week about whether, the founding of Gondolin is a good thing, whether Gondolin is admirable, whether Gondolin is kind of flawed in execution but sound in principle, or so flawed in its principle that it doesn't really matter how good the execution is. And we're going to see this fall out through the rest of the history of Beleriand, right? And in a sense, to some extent, through the history of the elves of Middle-earth. Like from here on out, the doom of the Noldor is going to be present. It is going to be active. It is going to continue to create these rifts between kin. We're going to see again and again treason and the fear of treason. Okay, so Thingol is calling this out by pulling the sons of Finarfin kind of closer to himself, right? They are his great nephews, great nieces here. That's the relationship because of the presence of Eowyn and Eowyn's marriage to Olwe. Galadriel says, yes, though the elves live in a dangerous world with Morgoth, so nothing will be as it ideally should be. Of course, you're absolutely right, Becky, and that is, Ardamard, right? This is the idea that none of this is as it was originally conceived. None of this is as it was intended to be. And I'm not just talking about the role of the elves, but, the role of the Valar in Arda, the role of any part of Arda, really, not as it was originally intended, but good will come of it, right? That's the that's the Eru Iluvatar promise. 100% good will come of all the evil of creation, I promise. But there is, again, right? If we are identifying the action, if we are identifying the principle as the focal point for morality in the Silmarillion, then we have to judge people by what their intentions are in that moment. And when we're getting to questions of caution, of protection, of seclusion, of hiding from the enemy, well, those are complicated principles, right? Because we're going to see in this week's reading, in fact, very clearly what happens to elves who separate themselves. I say we're going to see in this week's reading, we have already seen what happens to elves who separate themselves, what happens to beings who separate themselves. We're going to continue this track of people who draw into seclusion and are darkened by that. And is that not what's happening to Gondolin? Is that not what's happening to Nargothrond? Is there not some kind of reciprocal? And I say all of this, of course, not to really arrive at any concrete conclusion. I have a new show coming down the pike that is going to be predicated on the idea that I never have to arrive at a concrete conclusion, thank God. But I'm saying this to kind of try to understand what the aesthetic intent is here, right? We are dealing with a flawed world, you're absolutely right. We're dealing with the Noldor, who are now laboring under the doom of Mandos as well, but still we need to be able to differentiate between what are the good calls that are made by Turgon, by Finrod, right? What are the good calls that are made by Maethros, and what are the bad calls? Where do we see the doom of the Noldor take effect, right? Where does that friction happen? Where does the rubber of that doom meet the road of their fate, right? How do we identify and understand these turning points? And not just within the pages of the Silmarillion, of course, but within the pages of the whole Legendarium. How do we understand Tolkien's perspective on what is moral and what is good as it's presented to us through his Legendarium? Let's cut back here because I think we're going to get a pretty strong answer in just a moment as we move into the words of Angrod here. Then Finrod was greatly troubled, but he was silent, for he could not defend himself, save by bringing charges against the other princes of the Noldor, and that he was loath to do before Thingol. But in Angrod's heart the memory of the words of Caranthir welled up again in bitterness, and he cried, Lord, I know not what lies you have heard, nor whence, but we come not red-handed. Guiltless we came forth, save maybe of folly to listen to the words of fell Feanor, to become as if besotted with wine, and as briefly. No evil did we do on our road, but suffered ourselves great wrong, and forgave it. For this we are named talebearers to you, and treasonable to the Noldor, untruly as you know, for we have done for we have of our loyalty been silent before you, and thus earned your anger. But now these charges are no longer to be borne, and the truth you shall know. Then Angrod spoke bitterly against the sons of Feanor, telling of the blood at Alqualonde, and the doom of Mandos, and the burning of the ships at Losgar. And he cried, Wherefore should we that endured the grinding ice bear the name of kinslayers and traitors? Yet the shadow of Mandos lies on you also, said Melian. But Thingol was long silent ere he spoke. Go now, he said, for my heart is hot within me. Later you may return, if you will, for I will not shut my doors forever against you, my kindred that were ensnared in an evil that you did not aid. With Fingolfin and his people also I will keep friendship, for they have bitterly atoned for such ill as they did. And in our hatred of the power that wrought all this woe, our griefs shall be lost. But hear my words. Never again in my ears shall be heard the tongue of those who slew my kin at Alqualonde. Nor in all my realm shall it be openly spoken while my power endures. All the Sindar shall hear my command, that they shall neither speak with the tongue of the Noldor nor answer to it. And all such as use it shall be held slayers of kin and betrayers of kin unrepentant. So, we've been talking about this coming for a little while now, and here it is. This is a suppression of the Quennian language. We're going to talk about that in a moment, because first of all, we need to focus, I think, on what happens, right? We get the fire of Angrod's heart as he just cannot contain himself anymore. Angrod, you'll remember, has already been called out, right? We're remembering here the words of Caranthir. Caranthir was the one who took against Amrod after he went to serve as envoy to Thingol in the first place, and Caranthir gets that passage where he talks smack about the sons of Finarfin and Eärwen, right? Implying that they are less purely Noldorin than the others are. And here his brother Angrod takes up that memory and wants to speak back against it. And again, I think we're presented with a choice that looks on the page like strength, that looks even like wisdom, right? But might reveal itself to be misguided, because ultimately Thingol pauses as Angrod cries out, right? Wherefore should we that endured the grinding ice bear the name of kinslayers and traitors? Why should we be lumped in with the sons of Feanor when we didn't do anything wrong? And as Melian says, yet the shadow of Mandos lies on you also, right? You are also subject to the doom of the Noldor. But Thingol takes a moment and carries himself as perhaps a king ought, right? We're seeing some wisdom here. We're seeing some gentleness here almost. Go now, for my heart is hot within me. He understands that he's not going to make good choices in this moment. Go now, for my heart is hot within me. Later you may return if you will, for I will not shut my doors forever against you, my kindred, that were ensnared in an evil that you did not aid. So that's fairly just. That's fairly decent of him in this moment, perhaps. With Fingolfin and his people also I will keep friendship, for they have bitterly atoned for such ill as they did. Okay, we're getting a little... This is a judgment call, right? It's not really necessarily within Thingol's power to determine whether or not they are worthy of redemption. But okay, he's not going to take arms against them or to hold them entirely responsible. But this is the crucial turn. And in our hatred of the power that wrought this woe, our griefs shall be lost. What happened at Alqualonde, what happened with the kinslaying to literally the kin of Thingol himself, was monstrous, was a disaster. But he's going to swallow that up with his hatred for Morgoth. Morgoth is the power that wrought all this woe. The grief will be consumed by it, and that's the moment where we leave the path of wisdom, right there, right? We are so pledged against Morgoth. We are so unified in our opposition that the grief is lost. But grief isn't a thing to ignore or to so thoroughly swamp with other emotions that it can't be processed, because grief is where wisdom comes from. It's the domain of Nienna, who weeps not for herself, but for the wounds of Arda. So even here, in this moment, I think of Thingol's unexpectedly great kind of kingly sagacity, right? His greatest patience, arguably his greatest wisdom. He's already revealing that Beleriand is in a sense doomed, right? That in a sense, all elven culture in Beleriand has become Fey. It has become death drunk, dedicated to this war of wrath against Morgoth. That rather than seeking justice or the grief that will bring wisdom, we are instead doubling down on hatred. We're doubling down on enmity. We're doubling down on wrath and warfare. And I should, I suppose, talk for a moment here about the power of this last turn, the fate of Quenya here in Beleriand, that it will no longer be... We've been foreshadowing this for chapters after chapters after chapters. I noted when we started moving from the Quenya literal names in the text and shifting to the Sindarin, and now this is why, because Quenya has been outlawed across Beleriand at the order of King Thingol, and this is power. Tolkien, of course, as a linguist, understood the power of suppressing language, because the suppression of language is a very effective kind of cultural warfare. If you don't have the language that unifies you with your people, then the identity of that society starts to fray and to erode extremely quickly. And I say this, of course, as a Scotsman whose own people endured the suppression of their language twice over in our history, two large active periods of suppression and 300 years of kind of intermittent suppression. The first after the Union of the Crowns in 1603, when there's a massive campaign against Scots throughout the Highlands in particular, and then in the wake of the Jacobite rebellions of the 18th century, that attempt to suppress Scots as a language is an active attempt to fray and erode Scottishness as a culture, Scotsness as an identity. Language defines the society, or really any group, as we can see with the development of internal slang and internal jargon. Once you outlaw language, or a specific language, a particular subset of language, then you are making war upon that culture itself, and it's a war that's very difficult to defeat, right? We're going to see that the High Lords of the Noldor continue using Quenya, and it stays as a language of wisdom, right? Some Quenya even makes it into the pages of The Lord of the Rings, but it is pretty comprehensively swamped by Sindarin at this point. And it's both an active kind of means of cultural conquest here from King Thindel against the Noldor who have returned to Beleriand, but it's also, as Tolkien understood, like a very realistic means of establishing the dominance and the superiority of one cultural group over another. Language is the key. Let's move on here to the departure from Doriath and to Finrod in Nargothrond. Then the sons of Finarfin departed from Menegroth with heavy hearts, perceiving how the words of Mandas would ever be made true, and that none of the Noldor that followed after Feanor could escape from the shadow that lay upon his house. And it came to pass, even as Thingol had spoken, for the Sindar heard his word, and thereafter throughout Beleriand they refused the tongue of the Noldor, and shunned those that spoke it aloud. But the exiles took the Sindarin tongue in all their daily uses, and the high speech of the West was spoken only by the lords of the Noldor among themselves. Yet that speech lived ever as a language of lore, wherever any of those people dwelt. It came to pass that Nargothrond was full wrought, and yet Turgon still dwelt in the halls of Vinyamar, when the sons of Finarfin were gathered there to a feast. And Galadriel came from Doriath, and dwelt a while in Nargothrond. Now King Finrod Felagund had no wife, and Galadriel asked him why this should be. But foresight came upon Felagund as she spoke, and he said, "An oath I too shall swear, and must be free to fulfill it and go into darkness. Nor shall anything of my realm endure that a son should inherit." But it is said that not until that hour had such cold thoughts ruled him, for indeed she whom he had loved was Amarié of the Vanyar, and she went not with him into exile. So we're concluding this chapter with this very somber moment, this very human moment, but again, this moment of prophecy, this moment of foresightedness, this moment of anticipation of the fall of Beleriand that is imminent, right? It's not that Finrod, now called Felagund, in his cave city of Nargothrond, does not want to be married. It is not that he doesn't value marriage. He loved Amarié of the Vanyar, and she went not with him into exile. This is one of the first sunderings, the personal sunderings of Finrod, right? That he is pulled away from the love of his life as we move forward from here. Forward from here, paren, from the context of being in Aman and looking forward to the flight of the Noldor. But now in this moment, as Galadriel says to him, well, hey, now you've got your city. If this is going to be stable, if this is going to endure, if this is a true bastion against the demands and the depredations of Morgoth, then why aren't you married? And he has the moment of foresight, right? Again, as we've called out before, a thing that happens to characters in Tolkien's work. Every now and then, you are just given this touch of genuine prophecy, right? It happens throughout The Lord of the Rings too, but this isn't our first time and won't be our last time here in the Silmarillion either. But Finrod has this moment. An oath I too shall swear, and must be free to fulfill it, and go into darkness, nor shall anything of my realm endure that a son should inherit. He's referring, as we'll see in chapter 18, in next week's reading, in fact, he's referring to his oath to Bara here. But it's explicit, again, once more in the text. Galadriel is asking, is the language of men of Gondor more like Quenya or Sindarin? More like Sindarin, right? Sindarin is really the dominant linguistic form of Elvish going forward. Some of the Quenya survives, and in some places, they're not so terribly different. And I'm simplifying it here, of course, as we generally simplify these things into two types of Elvish, right? Two Elven languages here, because there are more. We've noted before that the Teleri spoke like a subtly different variation, that every time... You know what? I'm going to put a pin in this because we're going to get to it when we introduce the men. And one of the first things that we get when we're introducing men into Beleriand itself is a description of how cultures are unified with other cultures, connected to other cultures, and also separated, distinguished from other cultures by linguistics, by these language clusters, by these language groups. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, certainly the bulk of language as we see it represented by the elves of the Lord of the Rings and by the later ages of Middle-earth is basically Sindarin. Some Quenya survives, but not as much as we might like. And it's, very intentional. Again, it's Tolkien not just having a playground for his created languages, but creating this hierarchy of history, this kind of sense that before this there was another, before that there was another. Right? Moving backwards through time, through these linguistic strata, so that you can determine, the original common concepts. We'll get to... we'll have a fine example of that actually in just a couple of slides' time when I'm looking at exactly how certain cognates have formed here in the kind of post-Quenya, mid-Sindarin historical period, right? I don't know that I was racking my brain there. Is there an actual name for this period? I guess the Long Peace, kind of, right? This is kind of where we are. But yeah, okay, let's move on to chapter 16 of Maeglin, and we're going to pick up with Arathel. As you might remember, I introduced all the various grandchildren of Finwë, and I said there wasn't much to note about Arathel except that she's Maeglin's mom. Well, that is where this story starts. So, chapter 16 of Maeglin. Arathel Arfiniel, the White Lady of the Noldor, daughter of Fingolfin, dwelt in Nevrast with Turgon, her brother, and she went with him to the hidden kingdom. But she wearied of the guarded city of Gondolin, desiring ever the longer the more to ride again in the wide lands and to walk in the forests that had been her wont in Valinor. And when 200 years had passed since Gondolin was full wrought, she spoke to Turgon and asked leave to depart. Turgon was loath to grant this, and long denied her. But at the last he yielded, saying, "Go then, if you will, though it is against my wisdom, and I forebode that ill will come of it both to you and to me. But you shall go only to seek Fingon, our brother, and those that I send with you shall return hither to Gondolin as swiftly as they may." But Arathel said, "I am your sister, and not your servant, and beyond your bounds I will go as seems good to me. And if you begrudge me an escort, then I will go alone." Then Turgon answered, "I grudge you nothing that I have. Yet I desire that none shall dwell beyond my walls who know the way hither, and if I trust you, my sister, others I trust less, to keep guard on their tongues." And Turgon appointed 3 lords of his household to ride with Arathel, and he bade them lead her to Fingon and Hithlum, and if they might prevail upon her. "And be wary," he said, "for though Morgoth be yet hemmed in the north, there are many perils in Middle-earth of which the lady knows nothing." Then Arathel departed from Gondolin, and Turgon's heart was heavy at her going. So Arathel. This is 200 years, as we'll note, after Gondolin is completed. Not Gondor so much, excuse me. After Gondolin is completed. This puts us at around 316 of the years of the sun. This is 250 years after the suppression of Quenya by Thingol and the events of the previous chapter. We are bouncing around the timeline. In the next chapter, we're going to bounce back like 200 years. We're just going to stay in this extended period between like 50 of the years of the sun and like 450 of the years of the sun. We're just bouncing around in this period to tell these individual stories. What is most striking here, particularly on the heels of the last chapter and Galadriel's conversation with Melian, is, I think, how strong Arathel is on the page. She likes to go riding, desiring ever the longer the more to ride again in the wide lands and to walk in the forest that had been her wont in Valinor. And she hangs out in Gondolin for 200 years, right? She is happy, there for 200 years, but then has enough and wants to leave. She is restless. And when Turgon, her king and brother, says, well, okay, you can go if you absolutely have to, but you're only going to see Fingon, and then the ones that I sent with you are going to return to Gondolin as swiftly as they may. And Arathel says, I am your sister and not your servant. Taking a stand. She's stronger, I think, than we might expect at this point. There's a note in the history of Middle-earth, in the later version of the Quenta as presented in the history of Middle-earth, Arathel is described thus, quote, She was younger in the years of the Eldar than her brethren, and when she was grown to full stature and beauty, she was greater and stronger than women's wont, and she loved much to ride on horse and to hunt in the forests, and there was often in the company of her kinsmen the sons of Fëanor, but to none was her heart's love given. And we get this great example of this strong, like physically very capable young woman who loves hanging out with the sons of Fëanor more than she likes hanging out with her own brothers, presumably because she feels some kinship there with the fiery sons of the Spirit of Fire. And although not, as you'll see, like romantically, right? To none was her heart's love given. So this restlessness, this pushing back against the constraint that she feels in Gondolin, this sets an expectation, a kind of thematic expectation that's going to follow us through this entire chapter, because we're going to be looking a lot at, well, some fairly simple oppositions, right? We're going to be looking a lot at freedom and constraint. We're going to be looking at light and dark. We're going to be looking at masculine and feminine, and we're going to see kind of reflections and similarities. We're going to see some typography happening in these comparisons, but we're also going to see a pretty fundamental clash of responsibility, of authority, of agency. We're going to be looking at how does one live and who has the authority to constrain that desire to live. And here we'll see, though Turgon is not happy about what is happening, he wants to keep Gondolin completely secluded, you'll remember, right? 200 years, no one has gone yet hither and thon. No one has left Gondolin because he doesn't want anyone to know how to get there, how to return. He doesn't want to divulge the secret paths. Moreover, the people who came to live in Gondolin basically did so by secret. So no one really outside of Gondolin knows what happened to those populations. There may be some speculation, but we don't know anything for sure. But Arathel wants to go, and neither as her brother nor as her king can Turgon prevent it. I grudge you nothing that I have, yet I desire that none shall dwell beyond my walls who know the way hither. And if I trust you, my sister, others I trust less to keep guard on their tongues. Okay, you can go, and let's just say that I trust you to keep the secret of Gondolin, but other people, they might not be as reliable as you, Arathel. But it doesn't matter, because ultimately Arathel goes hither nonetheless, and we'll get to the next slide here. Because of course she doesn't want to go to Hithlum, she doesn't want to go northwest to the lands of mist. She wants to go meet up with her buddies, the sons of Fëanor. But when she came to the ford of Brithiach in the river Sirion, she said to her companions, "Turn now south and not north, for I will not ride to Hithlum. My heart desires rather to find the sons of Fëanor, my friends of old." And since she could not be dissuaded, they turned south as she commanded and sought admittance into Doriath. But the march wardens denied them, for Thingol would suffer none of the Noldor to pass the girdle save his kinsfolk of the house of Finarfin, and least of all those that were friends of the sons of Fëanor. Therefore the march warden said to Arathel, "To the land of Celegorm, for which you seek, lady, you may by no means pass through the realm of King Thingol. You must ride beyond the girdle of Melian, to the south or to the north. The speediest way is by the paths that lead east from the Brithiach through Dimbar, and along the north march of this kingdom until you pass the bridge of Isgaldwin and the fords of Aros, and come to the lands that lie behind the hill of Himring. There dwell, as we believe, Celegorm and Cudofin, and it may be that you will find them, but the road is perilous." Then Arathel turned back and sought the dangerous road between the haunted valleys of Ered Gorgoroth and the north fences of Doriath. And as they drew near to the evil region of Nandurgatheb, the riders became enmeshed in shadows, and Arathel strayed from her companions and was lost. They sought long for her in vain, fearing that she had been ensnared or had drunk from the poisoned streams of that land, but the fell creatures of Ungoliant that dwelt in the ravines were aroused and pursued them, and they hardly escaped with their lives. When at last they returned and their tale was told, there was great sorrow in Gondolin. And Turgon sat alone, enduring grief and anger in silence. So, we see here the passion of Arathel. She does not want to go to Hithlum, but if that's the story that Turgon has to believe in order for her to leave Gondolin, then fine. So she and her three great lords of Gondolin ride forth, and she immediately says, actually, psych, I'm not going to Hithlum. I am going to go and find the sons of Fëanor, and we're going to do that by going down south through, or kind of southeast through Doriath. That's the most obvious way of finding passage into the northeast of Beleriand, where the sons of Fëanor are, except for the march wardens, right? Except for the guards of the realm of Doriath who say, actually, no. King Thingol says, no Noldor through here, right? Unless you are of the house of Finarfin, and doubly not if you like the sons of Fëanor, which you clearly do, then you don't get to come through. So you're going to have to wind your way around the northern side of Doriath, around the fringes of the girdle of Melian, and find your way into the northeast, which would be fine, except that is the most dangerous place in all of Beleriand right now, because that is where Ungoliant went after her final confrontation with Morgoth, some, what is this, 300 years before this present event. So she is still there. She's still shredded in the darkness, hiding away in Ered Gorgoroth and there in Nan Dungartheb, the Valley of the Dreadful Death, I'll remind you, is the literal translation there. And of course, we're getting like a kind of typographical echo even here, right? We're getting Arathel and her guards and her escort going into this place of spiders. We're getting the reference to the poison streams. We're getting the reference to the ensnarement. We're kind of echoing Thorin's company in Mirkwood, right? We're maybe remembering the loss of Bomber's memory. A thing to take a brief tangent that I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks. I've been thinking about how trivially, how casually The Hobbit dispenses with Bomber's fate at that point, right? That we really don't spend any time on it at all, and how terrifying it must be, because I don't know if you recall, but we're told very clearly that when Bomber falls into the stream, into the waters of Mirkwood at that point, when he eventually wakes, he doesn't remember anything from the beginning of the quest. Like, that's how long it has been. That's how much he loses in that moment. I think that's harrowing. I think that's really tough. And when we play it off at all, we're playing it off for comic relief, because that's the tone that we're trying to find there in the pages of The Hobbit. But I continue to secretly... Well, I was going to say I continue to secretly wish that the professor had finished his plan to rewrite The Hobbit in the tone of The Lord of the Rings. Of all the things that the professor could have spent years working on, that is maybe 5th or 6th on my list, honestly. But it would have been great to have like a more adult, more consistent, more developed look at the events of that story, particularly perhaps from a dwarvish perspective. It would be great if we had a text as focused on the dwarves as the Silmarillion is, of course, focused on the experience of the elves, or as the Hobbit is, in fact, on the Hobbit himself. Let's keep moving on here. As Arathel braves the wilds beyond Gondolin and, is lost, right? Strays from her companions and was lost. So her escort searches for her. They face the fell creatures of Ungoliant, right? And we should remember here too that there's every reason to think that the fell creatures of Ungoliant are not the spiders of Mirkwood. That's not what we're facing here. What we're facing are Shelobs. Shelobs en masse. Shelob is the last child of Ungoliant, but we're not, I think, led to believe that she is in any way of greater magnitude or greater power than the other children, the other spawn of Ungoliant. So for me, I think I'm pretty confident with Nan Durgatheb there being full of Shelobs, which is bad news. But of course, Arathel's escort here, Lords of the Noldorin, fresh come from Valinor, still with the light of Valinor in their faces and capable of great things. But they escape. They manage to return to Gondolin, and Turgon sits alone enduring grief and anger in silence. But that is not, of course, the end of the story. But Arathel, having sought in vain for her companions, rode on, for she was fearless and hardy of heart, as were all the children of Finwë. And she held on her way, and crossing Ysgaldwin and Aros, came to the land of Himlad, between Aros and Kellon, where Celegorm and Curufin dwelt in those days, before the breaking of the siege of Angband. At that time they were from home, riding with Caranthir east in Thargalion, but the people of Celegorm welcomed her, and bade her stay among them with honour until their lord's return. There for a while she was content, and had great joy in wandering free in the woodlands. But as the year lengthened and Celegorm did not return, she became restless again, and took to riding alone ever further abroad, seeking for new paths and untrodden glades. Thus it chanced in the waning of the year that Arathel came to the south of Himlad, and passed over Kellon, and there she was, and before she was aware, she was enmeshed in Nan Elmoth. In that wood in ages past, Melian walked in the twilight of Middle-earth when the trees were young, and enchantment lay upon it still. But now the trees of Nan Elmoth were the tallest and darkest in all Beleriand, and there the sun never came. And there Eol dwelt, who was named the Dark Elf. Of old he was of the kin of Thingol, but he was restless and ill at ease in Doriath, and when the girdle of Melian was set around the region of the forest of Rhegion, where he dwelt, he fled thence to Nan Elmoth. Then he lived in deep shadow, loving the night and the twilight under the stars. He shunned the Noldor, holding them to blame for the return of Morgoth to trouble the quiet of Beleriand. But for the dwarves he had more liking than any other of the elven folk of old. From him the dwarves learned much of what had passed in the lands of the Eldar. So back again to Nan Elmoth. We'll note some of the geography here. Himlad is just northeast of Doriath. It's not quite as east as Maethros' home on Himring, nothing like as east as Thargalion, right across the Gallion, where Caranthir lives and trades with the dwarves. So Adethel hangs out there for a little while with the people of Celegorm. She is welcomed, and she manages to enjoy herself for a little while, but less than a year, right? She spent 200 years in Gondolin, less than a year here with the people of Celegorm before she gets impatient, and she wanders south. She's feeling this restless spirit again into the twilight of Nan Elmoth, the Twilight Wood, literally the Twilight Wood, where, of course, Alwë met Melian just a few thousand years previously. And there she finds Eol. It isn't clear where Eol comes from. It doesn't offer a ready translation in either the Quenya or the Sindarin. It may be, from a dwarvish influence here. The name Dark Elf feels extraordinarily loaded, of course. And it's clear that the Tolkien here, I'm doing this thing where I want to pivot away from the text to like a more aesthetic appreciation of exactly what is happening here, right? Not because the text is insufficient, but because Tolkien has a clear authorial kind of storyteller intent that's happening, and we're kind of pulling out of that perspective for just a moment, or pulling out of the perspective of the raw text for just a moment. So we're here in Nan Elmoth, where Eol dwells, who is named the Dark Elf. Of old he was the king of Thingol, and he was restless and ill at ease in Doriath. Okay, so first let's note, restless and ill at ease in Doriath, after the girdle of Melian goes up, right, 300 some years before. We're kind of echoing what's happening here with Adethel. Eol, similarly, felt constrained. He felt bounded, so he left. He's kin of the king, in fact, in exactly the same way as Adethel is kin of the king, and they both feel the same restlessness. So we're drawing this this comparison, this point of connection between the two. And it's hard to know exactly, because trivially, we're opposing Arethel, the White Lady of Gondolin, right? The White Lady of the Noldor, with the Dark Elf, with Eol, the Dark Elf. And it's clear that we don't just mean that he is of the Moraquendi, right? Or the Morathel, that we should say in Sindarin. In other versions of the story scattered through the Legendarium, Tolkien speculates that Eol could have been a Vari, right? He could have been a refuser. He could have been an elf who didn't answer the summons to go to Valinor in the first place, but eventually wandered by himself over the arid Luin into Beleriand. We know that's not true here because, well, I guess we don't know for sure, because certainly some of the kin of Alwë didn't go, but we have him resident in Doriath, which means that he was, of Thingol's actual people. And we're getting this very provocative light and dark comparison here. And it's difficult to know always what to do with this because of Tolkien's approach to darkness, right? And we're seeing a pivot as we move through this period of history in Beleriand, away from darkness as being something that is comforting, something that is good, something that is of the elves, right? The elves who awaken under the starlit skies of Cuivanen. We're going to see explicit examples of this when, spoilers, Eol gets to Gondolin in the pages to come, but we're now suspicious of the elves that live in the darkness. Hey, the sun is the whole thing now. Haven't you heard? The sun is this shiny new thing in the sky, and it rules, and now we're kind of looking with skepticism on the elves who still want to remain in the dark. So we're contrasting Gondolin as this white city, and Adethel as the White Lady of the Noldor, and Eol, the Dark Elf, who is shrouded in the shadows of Nan Elmoth, where the sun now no longer comes. It's not even the sense that it's the forest of twilight as it was back in Melian's day, but now the forest of absolute night. He lived in deep shadow, loving the night and the twilight under the stars. He shunned the Noldor, holding them to blame for the return of Morgoth, which is dubious. I mean, it's kind of factually incorrect, first off, right? Well, again, I want to continually draw attention to these moments where characters hold beliefs which might seem to be justifiable or even wise, but are perhaps more a symptom of the doom of the Noldor than they are of real wisdom, of real sagacity here. So he holds the Noldor to blame for the return of Morgoth, which is just factually incorrect, right? But also, he flees Doriath after the girdle of Melian is established, which is as the Noldor are returning to Beleriand. Those two things are happening at the same time. The girdle is established after that first unnamed battle of Beleriand. So even in the flow of history, even in the cause and effect of these various events, he's kind of overextending himself interpretively in order to blame the Noldor for the return of Morgoth, and to hold that position from the dark forests of Nan Elmoth, where he's already fled from Doriath. But that's not important, right? How he feels about the Noldor right now, not terribly important. Will be important at the end of the chapter. But right now, what's more important is that actually he really likes the dwarves. And really liking the dwarves is a thing that I think we can be supportive of. That's a thing that we can praise here, right? Lots of elves really like the dwarves, or lots of elves at least sufficiently like the dwarves. And that seems to be an indication that Eöl is not just being presented as a monster, right? It's almost tempting as you're reading this to think of, I don't know, some kind of Beauty and the Beast situation. And I'm not letting Eöl off the hook for the things that he does in the pages to come. But it's not as simple as suggesting that he's some dark, twisted monster that's living in the forest, right? There's something more to it than that. Let's keep pushing on here. Glorfin David is posting by proxy here in the live chat. Glorfin David, it's good to have you with us. I hope you'll be able to make it more fully and corporeally in person, to bring your soul from the halls of Mandos back to re-inhabit Hroa live with us next week on the show. But it's good to have you with us nonetheless. And thank you, Becky, for acting as a proxy here for David. Let's look at the traffic here of the dwarves and ultimately the fate of Arathel. Now, the traffic of the dwarves down from the Blue Mountain followed two roads across East Beleriand, and the northern way, going toward the Ford of Arrows, passed nigh to Nan Elmoth, and there Eöl would meet the Naugrim and hold converse with them. And as their friendship grew, he would at times go and dwell as guest in the deep mansions of Nogrod or Belegost. There he learned much of metalwork, and came to great skill therein, and he devised a metal as hard as the steel of the dwarves, but so malleable that he could make it thin and supple, and yet it remained resistant to all blades and darts. He named it Galvorn, for it was black and shining like jet, and he was clad in it whenever he went abroad. But Eöl, though stooped by his smithwork, was no dwarf, but a tall elf of a high kin of the Teleri, noble though grim of face, and his eyes could see deep into shadows and dark places. And it came to pass that he saw Arathel or Finiel, as she strayed among the tall trees near the borders of Nan Elmoth, a gleam of white in the dim land. Very fair she seemed to him, and he desired her. And he set his enchantments about her, so that she could not find the ways out, but drew ever nearer to his dwelling in the depths of the wood. There were his smithy and his dim halls, and such servants as he had, silent and secret as their master. And when Arathel, weary with wandering, came at last to his doors, he revealed himself, and he welcomed her, and led her into his house. And there she remained, for Eöl took her to wife, and it was long ere any of her kin heard of her again. So, Eöl spends time with the dwarves and has become physically twisted by his smithcraft. Not, we can be pretty certain, because smithcraft, invariably twists the body. Certainly there's no suggestion that Feanor is twisted by the time that he spends at his forge. He seems typically tall and handsome and robust, this fine example of elven manlyhood despite his skill at the forge. And it isn't just about being like the dwarves, right? The Naugrim might appear stunted and unlovely to the elves, but they aren't depicted as being evil. They aren't depicted as being, fundamentally objectionable, particularly at this point in history. And I'm going to tag all of this because we're going to return to the underlying idea here when we get to Maeglin in a few pages, and we get to talk about this really important aspect of Tolkien's philosophy as it applies to his secondary creation. There's going to be a real nut to crack in the I guess what, next slide, maybe even a couple slides from now. I should parse Galavorn here, literally, of course, just shining black, right? As it's given to us, as it's described. Galvorn, for it was black and shining like jet. Galvorn, shining black, yeah. And I don't know what this is supposed to be exactly. I don't know. I have trouble kind of imagining exactly what it is that Professor Tolkien is describing here, right? A substance that is harder than dwarven steel, more resistant to blade and dart, and yet is flexible, thin, and supple, and presumably comfortable enough to wear that Eöl can just wear it all the time when he goes abroad, right? This elf clad all in black, kind of doubling down on this idea of being the dark elf. And of course, now we have to talk about if Eöl is not monstrous in a traditional sense, he engages in some actions here which are certainly not, are just unambiguously not good. There's so many interesting things happening in terms of our approach to this story. The most obvious, I think, is that this is a fairy story. And we've talked before about Nan Elmoth. Actually, we talked before about how even the elves can enter into fairy stories within the span of Tolkien's Legendarium, right? When Elwë goes into the forest and meets with Maeglin and comes out as King Thingol, taller and smarter and wiser and better, faster, stronger than before, that is a kind of fairy story. It's unusual in fairy stories because it has a generally positive ending, right? But straying into the realm of fairy and meeting a being of a categorically different order than yourself, that's fairy story. That's classic fairy story. And what happens here is different, but there's a reason that I've had Beauty and the Beast in my head kind of all day, because this is not completely dissimilar. He's enchanting the forest, right? So first of all, we get Eöl glimpsing Arathel as she strays among the tall trees near the border of Nan Elmoth, a gleam of white in the dim land, very fair she seemed to him, and he desired her. Okay, good, fine. Up to that point, maybe not, worthy of great applause and approbation, but at least decent. No one has done anything wrong at this point. There is this girl, the white lady of the Noldor, right here in the fringes of my forest. She seems hot. I would like to get to know her. Okay, defensible. But then he starts weaving enchantment, and this is where we start getting down a treacherous road. I think he sets his enchantments about her so that she would not find her way out, but drew ever nearer to his dwelling in the depths of the wood. There were his smithy and his dim halls, and such servants as he had, silent and secret as their master. And when Arathel, weary with wandering, came at last to his doors, he revealed himself, and he welcomed her and led her into his house. Okay, not great that you're manipulating this girl and leading her to exhaustion. But okay, at least you're being, welcome. We don't know, of course, whether he tells her that, oh, actually, I have been enchanting the forest to guide you here all afternoon. And there she remained, for Eöl took her to wife, and it was long ere any of her kin heard of her again. And took her to wife, of course, is provocative, right? He takes Arathel to wed, and we need to acknowledge the subtext. So I guess minor trigger warnings here for domestic and sexual violence for the next 5 or 10 minutes, because this is one of the darker episodes in the entire volume, right? It's not the only time that we're going to do things like this, but this is an unusual tactic for Tolkien. This is not a kind of narrative loop that Tolkien generally messes with at all, but here it is, and it's kind of unvarnished, so it behooves us, I think, to talk about it. Let's begin by noting that per the chapter, I mentioned this before, the chapter Laws and Customs of the Eldar in Morgoth's Ring, right? It can be found in the 10th book in the history of Middle-earth. According to that chapter, which gives us some information about elven betrothal and all the various customs, right? The laws and customs, in fact, as the title of the chapter would suggest. We're told that a typical elven betrothal involves the giving of rings and the passage of a full year, during which time either party can change their mind, and then they take a very simple oath, it seems, invoking the name of Iluvatar, and then that's it, they're married. And there's no kind of functional mechanism for divorce. There's no functional mechanism for remarriage even, which is one of the things that makes Finwë's whole deal after the death of Feanor's mother Midial, right? That's one of the things that makes that so complicated and controversial, is that up until that point, the elves have never had to think about what happens after a marriage is effectively ended, let alone as ambiguously ended as Finwë's marriage to Miriel Cinderé is. So that's the traditional betrothal, but that's not the only custom, because what that chapter explicitly says is that the betrothal customs are dispensable and that marriage between elves can simply occur upon the act of bodily union, that is, sex. So the taking of Arathel by Eöl clearly fails to meet the requirements of the conventional betrothal and marriage. In fact, Thingol is going to call out the fact that it fails to meet those requirements, which means that we are talking here about a sexual act. And, well, we'll clear up an ambiguity right in a moment. At the beginning of the next slide, we're going to be told that Arathel is not unwilling, right? Which classically is an example of litotes, right? It's the abrogation of the negative. Not that she is willing, but she is not unwilling. In later versions of this story, which Tolkien is writing up until the 1960s, that ambiguity is stripped away. Eöl takes Arathel by force in later versions of this story, including, this is a direct quote from that later version, a very wicked deed in the eyes of the Eldar. And Tolkien had previously considered the question of sexual assault and rape in elven culture, and had noted that it was extremely rare. he even notes that ultimately in hypothetical situations of rape, the victim can choose to flee from their body, preserving their fea, right, in the halls of Mandos, leaving their hroa behind, which is, God, I mean, that is a powerful and, Laitotes not uncomplicated way of approaching all of this. That says a lot about what you hold the crime of rape or sexual assault to be, right? The exact nature of the transgressive act there. And all of this works together. All of this blends together to make it clear that Tolkien had considered this much, much darker version of the Arathel and Eol story. The version that we get here in the Silmarillion takes the edge off a little bit by noting, let me advance here onto the next slide, it is not said that Arathel was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful for her for many years, right? We'll get into the rest of the slide in just a moment. I want to present that, but that is not to say that Tolkien is not mindful either of the sexual dynamics and the power imbalance that is at play here, or the kind of implication that he is making in the pages of the Silmarillion, right? The kind of implication that he's making in the pages of this version of this story. He's very mindful of how this sounds and of what conclusion the reader might draw, and validates that, I think, with some of this supporting work. It's harrowing, and I think, yeah, we're going to have opportunities to talk a little more, thankfully not too much more, about this kind of subject as we move through the latter chapters of the Silmarillion. I guess I'm urging us now to consider two things. Firstly, to consider that for all that Professor Tolkien seems to be a very romantic but not sexual writer, right? Not a lot of sexual tension in the pages of the Legendarium, in the pages of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, for example. A little bit, not to say none, but really not that much. For all that does not make its way into his work, he wasn't naive about the way that men and women interact. He wasn't naive about the kinds of things that awful, awful men can do. And I'm saying awful, awful men here because, of course, I'm going to draw the connection, the chain of connections here back through, Eol and Feanor and all the way back to Melkor, right? Melkor is shunned by Varda. Melkor is refused by Varda, and that seems to be one of the things that contributes to his Melkorness, right? It's exactly the same as I observed back when we were talking about the Ainulindale, that Melkor has this relationship with shame and anger, right? Tolkien clearly has a very strong understanding of what twists and sours and turns bitter in the hearts of young men who lack sufficient wisdom and sufficient support and are isolated in their own fury and self-regard, right? He sees that happen and can account for it in these pages. The story of Feanor that I'm referring to doesn't make it into the Silmarillion as it's published, but it is an absolutely consistent part of Feanor's backstory. This is Feanor wanting Galadriel's hair. Galadriel's hair being kind of totemically representative of Galadriel herself, which is all the worse when you remember, of course, that Feanor is Galadriel's uncle. That's the relationship that's happening there. At least Arathel and Eol are much further apart. We're not going to have to deal with too many. Well, you know what? We're going to be dealing with it by the end of this chapter. So let's put a pin in topics of romance and desire between close family members for now. All of this is to say that Professor Tolkien, for all of the relative sexlessness of his writing, was not ignorant to these motivations and the way that these emotions sour and darken. So I just want to have that there. And as we are dealing with this, as we're moving forward, I think it behooves us to deal again, right, with the aesthetic presentation, with what is being communicated to the reader beyond the literal text on the page. Because, let me call the slide back up, one of the things that we can do here is look at this and say, it is not said that Arathel was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. Okay. Well, firstly, let's gauge with the litotic quantities here, right? Not wholly unwilling is not the same as being wholly willing. We're distancing ourselves 3 times here, in fact, right? It is not said, right? We're not getting the usual Tolkienian, it is said that, and then we get something that is effectively true. It is not said, right? We're getting, again, the abrogation of the negative. It is not said that she was wholly unwilling. So it is not said that she was wholly unwilling. Between the litotic combination there with wholly unwilling, we're distancing ourselves 3 times over. Not said wholly and the not unwilling there, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. For though at Eäl's command she must shun the sunlight, they wandered far together under the stars or by the light of the sickle moon, or she might fare alone as she would, save that Eäl forbade her to seek the sons of Fëanor or any others of the Noldor. Yeah, exactly. As Gladrebecki calls out here, there's a lot more of it later with the men and women of Numenor. Yes, and sadly, even before we get to Numenor, we take some dark turns as we're heading forward here, for sure. So even here, functionally, in Eäl's domain of Nan Elmoth, Arathel is once again imprisoned. We're seeing again a kind of echo. We're seeing again this kind of reciprocity. She came from the light of Gondolin into the dark of Nan Elmoth, but functionally, it's the same. She can go where she likes, as long as she doesn't go where Eäl doesn't want her to go. They can walk together under the stars or by the light of the sickle moon. In her heart, Arathel bore to Eäl a son in the shadows of Nan Elmoth, and in her heart she gave him a name in the forbidden tongue of the Noldor, Lomion, that signifies child of the twilight, but his father gave him no name until he was 12 years old. Then he called him Maeglin, which is sharp glance, for he perceived that the eyes of his son were more piercing than his own, and his thought could read the secrets of hearts beyond the mist of words. As Maeglin grew to full stature, he resembled in face and form rather his kindred of the Noldor, but in mood and mind he was the son of his father. His words were few, save in matters that touched him near, and then his voice had a power to move those that hurt him, and to overthrow those that withstood him. He was tall and black-haired. His eyes were dark, yet bright and keen as the eyes of the Noldor, and his skin was white. Often he went with Eäl to the cities of the dwarves in the east of Ered Lunden, and there he learned eagerly what they would teach, and above all the craft of finding the ores of metals in the mountains. So, Arathel's life maybe doesn't seem too bad, or we're told at least that she doesn't hate it for many years, but we are presented with a life that is, in its shape and construction, not at all dissimilar from her time in Gondolin. And then we have the son. So, Maeglin. Maeglin is going to do some bad things. Maeglin is going to commit the greatest treachery in the Legendarium, arguably. And I want to pause here to think about, at this moment of his introduction, I want to think about how Tolkien handles parents and children, primarily because it's tempting to look at Maeglin as being just the son of Eäl, right? To view all of his flaws as being the consequence of his father's flaws. And I don't think it's that simple. It's also easy to look at Maeglin as being someone who is one of these young men who is like twisted and perverted by rejection, is warped into something darker by the rejection of the woman that he wants, which is also true, but also incomplete, right? Because in a broader sense, what we're about to see unfold here doesn't just apply to fathers and sons, but to most, if not all, of Tolkien's characters, because Professor Tolkien repeatedly makes the very unfashionable choice to not allow his characters to arc. He rarely, if ever, writes a traditional, conventional, mainstream character arc. We've understood collectively, for as long as we've had stories, that some tales rely on a character arc for narrative power, right? The hero undertakes the quest, he's transformed by the experience, he accomplishes the goal. It is a cool story format. It's accessible. It allows us to believe in things like transformation and things like redemption and things like the fulfillment of potential, right? But for most of human history, that kind of heroic narrative has only been one of the many kinds of story that we have access to. It's not until the middle of the 20th century, it's not until 1949 and the publication of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, his brilliant work of comparative mythology, that this kind of hero's journey narrative structure becomes completely dominant. Dominant to the point that now you can see serious people teaching serious creative writing classes, people on screenwriting Reddits talking about the hero's journey as though it is the only functional narrative structure, the only kind of story in which we should be interested. And that is, simply and self-evidently untrue, because there are lots of stories which obviously work, but which, try as you might, contort yourself as you may into interpretive knots all day and night, you cannot make work as hero's journey stories. The Silmarillion being a prime example of that. Tragedy, for example, is a narrative form that's largely incompatible with the hero's journey. Hamlet and Jay Gatsby and Anakin Skywalker don't meaningfully change. They don't have character arcs. The power of the narrative comes from seeing the darkness that is within them from the beginning, forcing them to unravel. The same is true for Feanor, right? The same is true as of basically everybody who is laboring under the doom of the Noldor at this point in the story. And when Tolkien isn't writing completely tragic narratives, which he so often does, particularly in this Silmarillion quasi-historical mode, when he's not writing complete tragedies, he's telling stories of integration rather than transformation, right? Bilbo isn't changed operatively by his adventure in The Hobbit. He becomes more himself, more Took and more Baggins in combination. He is more fully the Bilbo that is there on the first page, but he is not meaningfully different from the Bilbo that is there on the first page. Galadriel isn't changed by her time in Middle-earth. She doesn't arc in the traditional sense, or in Lothlorien in particular, I suppose I should say. Passing the test of the ring isn't a consequence of external transformation. It is a consequence of internal integration, of finding peace, of becoming more Galadriel, right? That's why she will remain Galadriel. She is still, there is a fierce continuity, a defiant continuity of existence from first to last as far as Galadriel goes. When people are changed in Tolkien's story, it is usually to become more themselves, more in accord with their true nature, right? We can think of the transformation of Gollum over the many years, but Gollum is just becoming who Smeagol always was. Smeagol kills Deagol at the first, before the ring has any real powerful influence over him in the first place. Boromir is another great example, right? Because we think of Boromir falling and then redeeming himself, but the truth is that he doesn't. That's not the arc. He is both the heroic and the tragic. He is both selfless and incredibly desirous of glory. His end is heroic, but his moments of failure still count. They remain evil, as Mandos would tell us. So these characters, all of Tolkien's characters, which fit the historical, mythological schematic which Tolkien is presenting to us, right? They are kind of static, at least to modern tastes. If you believe that the hero's journey is the only kind of valid story, then it's easy to look at Tolkien's work and not see characters who, capital A, arc. And that's because Tolkien is an essentialist. Tolkien believes that there is a kind of thing which you are, and that thing defines you. You might be lucky enough to have several kinds of things which you are. You might be a man of Middle-earth and a king and a warrior, and each of those things will define you in different ways, right? We've talked about his gender essentialism before, and it's difficult, increasingly difficult, as we move through the history of Beleriand and we're on the cusp of the arrival of man into the West. It's difficult to escape his racial essentialism. Elves are like this, dwarves are like this, men are like this, hobbits are like this. Each of these categories of being is distinct, and there's little to no ambiguity in our understanding of them. And we see it, distilled down even further in terms of the elves. We see it in the houses of the Eldar, right? And then in the sub-houses of the children of Finwë. Feanor's kids are dangerous. Fingolfin's kids are valiant, but ultimately perhaps too cautious. Finarfin's kids are fair, blonde, literally, right? You'll remember Finarfin's kids are the only ones who have blonde hair, unlike the other dark-haired Noldor, but they are also beautiful. Who you are as a person in Arda is defined in large part by what you are. And I guess I don't mean that restrictively in the sense that we are lacking social mobility, though we are, of course, almost completely lacking social mobility. But what I mean is that your nature is largely prescribed by your birth, either in harmony with your society and community or in disharmony, right? Either you are born well into your community and kind of inhabit that role in a way that is beneficial. You take the best of what your community has to offer, like most of the children of Finwë, I would argue. Or you're in disharmony with your community, like Feanor, right? Not just completely flawed, not completely broken, but something is misaligned in that birth. It is possible, under Tolkien's schematic, right, to have a meaningful conversation, to sit down with your friends and have a meaningful conversation about whether or not Bilbo is a good hobbit, capital G, capital H. It is possible to sit down and wonder whether Thorin is a good dwarf or Thranduil is a good elf, in a way that would be much more difficult, if not outright offensive, to have those conversations about modern people in the modern world, right? Is so-and-so a good human well, what does that even mean? Like to be human is to be human, right? We have a classification that kind of supersedes all judgments associated with that, because we are not, broadly speaking, in the 21st century here in the Western world, we are not essentialist by nature. We have kind of moved into a much more relativist kind of understanding of identity and of personality and of being. To modern people in the modern world, we generally favor kind of self-determination and nurture over nature in the battle to define the individual. There are, within the Legendarium, no good orcs. It is impossible to conceive of a good orc, because to be an orc is to be evil. Speaking of dark elves, right? Obviously, knowing that Professor Tolkien doesn't mean this, but if we're thinking of dark elves in the traditional D&D sense, Professor Tolkien would never write the story of Drizzt Do'Urden. He would never write the story of the drow, like who turns good. And this is why, by the way, we change things for the movies, right? This is why we add into the movie Aragorn's whole self-doubt about kingship. This is a product of this modern perspective on this medieval hero archetype. Aragorn in the books never doubts that he's the rightful king or that he would be a good king, because his essence is that of the king. To dispute that would be pointless. It's basically a fundamental objective truth that both kings are good and Aragorn is the king. Thus, he doesn't have that same push-pull, difficult, tangled, kind of slightly adolescent relationship with his fate to be king as we see in the movies. And I don't say this because I agree with Tolkien's essentialism, right? Again, I suppose I should probably distinguish here too between what Tolkien the man thought, right, as a person who lived through the 20th century, versus Tolkien the medievalist, Tolkien the mythopoet, Tolkien the historian, who is creating this Legendarium based on certain aesthetic principles that are not immediately accessible to the modern reader unless you've kind of suffused yourself in medieval literature. Rather, though, I think it behooves us, the reason that I'm bringing this up now as we move into the story of Maeglin is that it helps us to understand that one's origins play a much larger and significant role, I suppose, right? That where you come from, what you are, is going to be much more definitive of your nature as you move through the story of your life in the work of Tolkien than it would be in like a contemporary fantasy novel, right? We're getting closer and closer to this domestic drama side of the Silmarillion, and as we do, it really helps us to understand that these people are defined by their essences. They are defined by where they come from and what they are. So from this medievalist essentialist perspective, we're steeped in dramatic irony rather than steeped in domestic drama. We are not, I think, as readers of Tolkien, supposed to be looking at this story and thinking, wow, I hope Maeglin pulls through. I hope he doesn't make bad choices. I hope he doesn't do bad things because of circumstances which are going to affect him from this point forward. No. From a medievalist perspective, from an essentialist perspective, we're supposed to be looking at Maeglin and thinking, damn, kid's shot. Kid's got no hope. There's no way this is going to turn out well. We've already seen what goes into him. We already understand, in some sense, what he is. So what we should be feeling, rather than hope or investment or an uncertainty about what lies ahead, we should be able to read what is right there on the page in front of us and feel instead that dramatic irony, that a storm is brewing, that darkness is coming, that a tragedy awaits us. We understand Maeglin immediately to be a tragic figure. Again, just to clarify, in case any of this is ever, excerpted out for any kind of short form video content out there on the internet, essentialism in real life completely sucks, right? Human beings in real life are so much more fantastically varied and changeable and transformable and unpredictable and unreliable and redeemable than characters are in fiction, which is one of the reasons that we need fiction in the first place. One of the reasons that we have fiction is to make simplified versions of the world around us so that we can better understand the world around us, right? We metaphorize our real experience into simpler forms that we can then process intellectually and emotionally. It's one of the great things that storytelling can do, is allow us better access to the world around us by creating shortcuts to understanding and to comprehension and to sensitivity and to empathy in our real lives. So with all of that said, I'm catching up here in the chat with Glad Rebecca. Not all of Tolkien's kings are good. Reference Numenor again. I mean, yes, for sure, right? But the nobility of Aragorn's line, I think, is kind of beyond any exemption there. And certainly, yeah, as I say, I don't think it's a bad addition to the movie. It's you know what, we're going to get the opportunity to talk about the movies. It's one of the things which I find most interesting. It doesn't get a lot of attention, and when it gets attention, it's usually in the, Peter Jackson doesn't even understand. He's just reducing the story down into a more accessible form for the popcorn munchers in the Cineplex, right? Not true, and really never true. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that there's a fairly transparent cause and effect with all of the decisions that Jackson and Walsh and Boyens make through the Lord of the Rings films and through the Hobbit films too. You can almost always, I think, if you are calm, if you are, approaching it from a chill position, you can almost always understand what the challenges that they're facing and why they make the choice that they make in order to resolve that question or to avoid that problem, something in the book that they are either struggling to manifest literally or don't want to, or, to make all of these various choices. You can almost always, because it is a very authoritative and kind of self-possessed process of adaptation, you can almost always identify what they are trying to do and why. And then you can gauge how much it works depending on your response to that film, right? Your aesthetic response to that film. You can say, actually, this transition in Aragorn's character is good. Actually, introducing Arwen at the Fords of Bruinen is good. Actually, Gimli being comedy dwarf is very bad. But I do understand why they did it. Like, it's my least favorite thing about those films, but I understand why, right? You look at those films and you think, this needs some comedy. Where are we going to put some comedy? We're going to put some comedy in Gimli. We need to be able to break the tension of this incredibly, dramatic sequence of events. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to make one of these characters funny, and that character is going to be Gimli, and that's just a choice that we have made. And it is adaptation. It is a change, right? There's no way of doing adaptation without change. Those words are basically the same. Yeah. I'm getting so deep into the movie adaptation now. I don't know how this happened. We should be talking about Maeglin, of course. Galadriel Beck is saying, I do agree that movie Aragorn is modified from Tolkien's intent to match a more modern expectation, and I like book Aragorn better. Me too. Both ways, right? Absolutely both ways. I don't love that particular aspect of Aragorn. I don't. I do understand it because, there's a reason that every few weeks I have to talk about the expectation of the medieval mind coming to a book like this, and the way that the medievalist interacts with notions of kingship, right? That's a real sticking point for a modern audience, particularly a general modern audience, especially a general modern audience that I think has been influenced at least as much by those fantasy stories which come after Tolkien as by the stories of Tolkien themselves, right? Those stories which follow thereafter, but which sever themselves from Tolkien's deep medievalist historian roots. We get a very weird picture of kings in like modern fantasy. You go read your David Eddings, you go read your R.A. Salvatore, right? You go read your Remedy Feist, your Weiss and Hickman, right? Through the middle of the 80s. You're getting a really weird idea about what kings are and how they work and like how nobility works in a feudal system that still looks and feels like a feudal system that's recognizable to us through Tolkien, right? Kind of using Tolkien as the prism of accessing the medieval period, but which has become philosophically, like fundamentally disconnected from what makes that system work in the first place. I am so distracted here. Galadriel Beck is just taunting me now by pointing out that Gimli's the one who got Galadriel's hair. Yes, that's why that is so important, right? If you know the story of the Silmarillion, if you know that Fëanor is initially begging for a lock of Galadriel's hair, the reason for this, we're told, is that Galadriel's hair has elements of both Telperion and Laurelin, right? It kind of feels like the light of the trees has been captured in her hair. We're told in this alternate version of the story that this is what gives Fëanor the idea of the Silmarils in the first place, right? Is to capture and imprison, like a very powerful verb there, to imprison the light of the trees inside something else, because he sees that in Galadriel's hair. And he asks her first for a lock of her hair, and she refuses. And then he modifies it and says, just a single strand of your hair. And she refuses. She turns him down again. And he is mad about that. They are unfriends ever after, is what we're told in that version of the story, which is just fantastic, right? It's just great. Another example of Galadriel just taking nothing from no one, just absolutely walking her own path in a way that I think is heroic, in a way that I think is just fantastic. But yes, that's what makes the gift of the hairs to Gimli at the end of their time in Lothlorien so incredibly powerful. It's such a statement of partly who Gimli is, right? one of the reasons that I don't like him being turned into comedy dwarf is that he has a soul of great nobility in that story, if you read the published book. But also it's Galadriel demonstrating how different she is now, how far she has come, how more fully integrated she is. I have taken the world's largest series of tangents here, and we absolutely have to get back. I'm not even going to finish this chapter tonight. This is terrible, you guys. Okay, you know what? It's the journey, not the destination that counts. Here, let's get back to the story of Maeglin, who we're told loves his mama. Yet it is said that Maeglin loved his mother better, and if Eöl were abroad, he would sit long beside her and listen to all that she could tell him of her kin and their deeds in Eldamar, of the might and valour of the princes of the house of Fingolfin. All these things he laid to heart, but most of all that which he heard of Turgon, and that he had no heir. For Elenwë his wife Elenwë his wife perished in the crossing of the Helcaraxe, and his daughter Idril Celebrimbor was his only child. In the telling of these tales, there was awakened in Arethel a desire to see her own kin again, and she marvelled that she had grown weary of the light of Gondolin and the fountains in the sun, and the green sward of Tumlodden under the windy skies of spring. Moreover, she was often alone in the shadows when both her son and her husband were away. Of these tales also grew the first quarrels of Maeglin and Eöl. For by no means would his mother reveal to Maeglin where Turgon dwelt, nor by what means one might come thither, and he bided his time, trusting yet to wheedle the secret from her, or perhaps to read her unguarded mind. But ere that could be done, he desired to look on the Noldor and speak with the sons of Feanor, his kin that dwelt not far away. And when he declared his purpose to Eöl, his father was wrathful. "You are of the house of Eöl, Maeglin, my son," he said, "and not of the Golothrim. All this land is the land of the Teleri, and I will not deal nor have my son deal with the slayers of our kin, the invaders and usurpers of our homes. In this you shall obey me, or I will set you in bonds." And Maeglin did not answer, but was cold and silent, and went abroad no more with Eöl, and Eöl mistrusted him. So, Maeglin loves his mother, and in the long hours that they spend, the days, the weeks, presumably, that they spend by themselves here in Nan Elmoth when Eöl is abroad visiting the dwarves, he hears her stories, and he loves the stories. He loves the deeds in Eldamar, in Valinor, and of the might and the valor of the princes of the house of Fingolfin, right? This kind of the epic legendarium stuff that's happening here. But what he really loves is the story of Turgon, and the fact that Turgon has no heir. For Elenwë, his wife, perished in the crossing of the Helcaraxe. Again, right, you'll notice, no provision here for remarriage. No provision for the idea that Turgon is still young and presumably fertile and presumably would like to have more elves in Gondolin. There's just no capacity for it. He married Elenwë. Elenwë died. Turgon is now by himself. No more kids. His daughter, Idril Celebrimbor, was his only child. You'll remember us talking about Idril last week, introducing her, the greatest jewel of Gondolin here. And in the telling of these stories, we see Arethel's nature reassert itself. She's once again restless. She once again, and not just restless any like, well, I've been sitting here for a little while and I'm kind of bored, right? I'm familiar with this place. I want to go and see something new. No. Now we're seeing what the restlessness actually is, that it is a kind of dissatisfaction, that it's not that she wants to explore. She doesn't want to go see some new place. She doesn't want to go and hang with the Falathrim down by the shore. She doesn't want to cross the Ered Luin into Middle-earth proper. No, she's missing Gondolin. And more than missing it, she doesn't understand her own process. She marveled that she had grown weary of the light of Gondolin and the fountains in the sun and the green sword of Tumlodden under the windy skies of spring. She marvels at this. She doesn't understand the process that led her to be dissatisfied in the first place, that caused all of this to happen, of course. Then, of course, we have this moment where, again, we are not supposed to be looking at Maeglin thinking, God, I wonder if this kid's going to turn out to be good. I wonder if Maeglin can just pull through and really, defy his nature and become a hero. No, there's no question of that. What we're feeling here is this oppressive spirit of, we have been granted foresight, right? By the tone of the novel, by the form of the novel. We have been granted foresight. We know what's coming next. We're feeling all of that dramatic irony. For by no means would his mother reveal to Maeglin where Turgon dwelt, nor by what means one might come thither, and he bided his time. Okay, he really wants to go to Gondolin. He thinks Gondolin sounds cool. That's great. Well, except that he wants to go to Gondolin because Turgon doesn't have an heir, and that means that there's a power vacuum at the heart of Gondolin, potentially at least, right? There's space for a young man to exercise social mobility, that thing which is so impossible to the mind, antithetical to the mind of the good and faithful elf, right? He's looking to climb the ladder here. And how is he looking to climb the ladder? Well, he bides his time, trusting yet to wheedle the secret from her, or perhaps to read her unguarded mind, to violate his mother's privacy in order to understand not just something about her, not just a detail of her history, but the great secret, right? The great secret that has to be kept to keep Gondolin safe. And all of this causes a fight with his father. You are the house of Eol, Maeglin, my son, and not of the Golothrim. All this land is the house of the Teleri, and I will not deal nor have my son deal with the slayers of our kin, the invaders and usurpers of our home. In this one instance, Eol not being completely out of pocket, right? This is a perspective that a person could have. Actually, the Noldor are bad news. And I keep saying that the Noldor are bad news, and whether I decided that before they had really proven themselves to be bad news or after, doesn't really matter. I'm not going to deal with them. Treason and the fear of treason, again, kind of causing these rifts, I don't really have time to get into the whole seclusion, right? But I did want to call out the fact that Eol is secluded here with few servants, all of whom are silent. He has no one to push back on him. We're not seeing consonance here. We're seeing an echo of Melkor going off into the great void before the universe is created by himself to ponder the flame imperishable and how to get it. We're kind of seeing Feanor here going off by himself, going out to the fringes of Aman and being by himself in a way that allows his darker impulses and darker thoughts to fester, to curdle, to sour within him. We're seeing this pattern again and again, and Eol is doing it in a very minor key, right? Because he's just not as powerful as either of those two entities that I just described. But going off and being by yourself is not the answer, because you lack consonance and harmony with others, and you lack the rectifying influence of those around you, right? You lack the moral compass of society. If you're out by yourself, no one can tell you that you're misbehaving. No one can tell you that your thoughts are going astray, or that you are misaligned morally, because there's no one there. Eol is only surrounded by his servants and has dominion over both Addathal and Maeglin, so can't be corrected there either. So we're seeing the tragedy unfold, like very literally here. I should mention here the Golothrim. I was talking about various cognates between the Sindarin and the Quenya. Golothrim is the Sindarin cognate of the Quenya Noldor. It just means the Noldor. It's just very straight up. This is Eol proving his dark elf Sindarin bona fides here, right? He's not going to use the semi-Quenya form Noldor. He's going to use the Sindarin form Golothrim. So let's get to the departure here. It came to pass that at the midsummer the dwarves, as was their custom, bade Eol to a feast in Nogrod, and he rode away. Now Maeglin and his mother were free for a while to go where they wished, and they rode often to the eaves of the wood, seeking the sunlight, and desire grew hot in Maeglin's heart to leave Nan Elmoth forever. Therefore he said to Addathal, Lady, let us depart while there is time. What hope is there in this wood for you or for me? Here we are held in bondage, and no profit shall I find here, for I have learned all that my father has to teach, or that the Naugrim will reveal to me. Shall we not seek for Gondolin? You shall be my guide, and I will be your guard. Then Addathal was glad, and looked with pride upon her son, and telling the servants of Eol that they went to seek the sons of Feanor, they departed and rode away to the north eaves of Nan Elmoth. There they crossed the slender stream of Callan into the land of Himlad, and rode on to the fords of Ados, and so westward along the fences of Doriath. Now Eol returned out of the east sooner than Maeglin had foreseen, and found his wife and his son but 2 days gone, and so great was his anger that he followed after them even by the light of day. As he entered the Himlet, he mastered the wrath and went warily, remembering his danger, for Caligorm and Curufin were mighty lords who loved Eol not at all, and Curufin, moreover, was of perilous mood. But the scouts of Aglon had marked the riding of Maeglin and Arathal to the fords of Ados, and Curufin, perceiving that strange deeds were afoot, came south from the pass and encamped near the fords. And before Eol had ridden far across the Himlet, he was waylaid by the riders of Curufin and taken to their lord. So, again, we're seeing these echoes, right? Hey, we're just imprisoned here. What future is there for us under the tyrannical boot of our father, of my father and your husband? We should leave. This is Feanor again, protesting the thraldom that the Noldor know under the hand, the fist, the boot of the Valar. Unlike Feanor, of course, Arathel and Maeglin are both actually imprisoned, and Eol is extending an authority that isn't entirely his own. What's perhaps most interesting and most surprising when I reread this chapter earlier today to prepare for this week's session is that this is the only line of dialogue that Maeglin gets. It's wild, because you think of Maeglin as being someone who opens his mouth too many damn times in the course of the Silmarillion, but he's all but silent. We get so many And Maeglin was silent, and Maeglin spoke not at all, right? We get so many of those little intrusions through the course of this chapter, but we get this one block of dialogue. Lady, let us depart while there is time. What hope is there in this wood for you or for me? Here we are held in bondage, and no profit shall I find here, for I have learned all that my father has to teach, so that the Naugrim will reveal to me. Shall we not seek for Gondolin? You shall be my guide, and I will be your guard. I love how persuasive that last turn is, right? This is Maeglin using that power that he has to overthrow others with his words. You shall be my guide, and I will be your guard. We together, the two of us, mother and son, we will venture out into the wilderness. We will go to Gondolin, and you'll finally have everything that you want, right? And it works. Arathel is convinced. She looks with pride upon her son, and they ride away, telling the servants of Eol that they're going to the sons of Feanor, just kind of doing the inverse of her strategy leaving Gondolin, right? Saying they're going to one place so that they can go to another. It's exactly the same technique and trick here. It's worth noting here, I think, that Maeglin is at this point 80 years old, which is, of course, significant, but is basically, baby time for an elf. His mother, Arathel, is around 1,700 years old at this point, and his father, a neat round 4,000 or so. So Maeglin really is just a child, just beginning his adventure here. We get the reference here to Curufin the Crafty. We're going to talk about him in the next slide. Curufin the Crafty, as you'll remember, is the fifth son of Feanor. He's the father of Celebrimbor, who will later, get big into jewelry. Curufin is so much the son of Finwë that not only is he, not the son of Finwë, Curufin is so much the son of Feanor that not only is he described as being Feanor's favorite, but he is originally called Curufinwë, which is the name that Feanor has when he is born. Miriel Sindere calls Feanor Curufinwë. That is both Feanor's real name and Curufin's real name. It's his father name per the elven custom. Let's take a look at two elves being real jerks to each other here on Stars and Swords. Then Curufin said to Eol, "What errand have you, dark elf, in my lands? An urgent matter, perhaps, that keeps one so sun-shy abroad by day." And Eol, knowing his peril, restrained the bitter words that arose. And Eol, knowing his peril, restrained the bitter words that arose in his mind. "I have learned, Lord Curufin," he said, "that my son and my wife, the White Lady of Gondolin, have ridden to visit you while I was from home, and it seemed to me fitting that I should join them on this errand." Then Curufin laughed at Eol, and he said, "They might have found their welcome here less warm than they had hoped had you accompanied them. But it is no matter, for it was not their errand. It is not 2 days since they passed over the Arosiach, and thence rode swiftly westward. It seems that you would deceive me, unless indeed you yourself have been deceived." And Eol answered, "Then, Lord, perhaps you would give me leave to go and discover the truth of this matter." "You will have my leave, but not my love," said Curufin. "The sooner you depart from my land, the better it will please me." Then Eol mounted his horse, saying, "It is good, Lord Curufin, to find a kinsman thus kindly in need. I will remember it when I return." Then Curufin looked darkly upon Eol. "Do not flaunt the title of your wife before me," he said. "For those who steal the daughters of the Noldor and wed them without gift or leave do not gain kinship with their kin. I have given you leave to go. Take it and be gone. By the laws of the Elder, I may not slay you at this time. And this counsel I add, return now to your dwelling in the darkness of Nan Elmoth, for my heart warns me that if you now pursue those who love you no more, neither will you return thither." It's unclear whether Curufin is having a moment of that foresight, a moment of that prophetic vision here at the end of this slide, or if this is just a straight-up threat. Return now to your dwelling in the darkness of Nan Elmoth, for my heart warns me that if you now pursue those who love you no more, never will you return thither. So we're seeing here Eol as a real outsider, right? A functional outsider, as well as being like an outsider in principle here. He isn't trusted. And of course, we're bringing him here into contrast and conflict with Curufin because Curufin is, he's the Feanorian guy. He's the most Feanorian of all the sons of Feanor. He's the one that's going to take this kind of most provocative position and spark some of the conflict that we're going to see unfold through the rest of this chapter. But we're also seeing, yes, of course, some of that doom of the Noldor. We're seeing some of that treason and that fear of treason. We're also seeing some of this elven custom. The elves have now been settled in Beleriand, both Sindar and Noldor, for long enough that we are getting this sense that there is a shared culture, which, as well as defining them and unifying them is also a tool of division and distinction, which of course shared culture always is. This is the other side of the other side of the sword, to borrow Mellion's metaphor from before. This is the other side of the sword of the suppression of Quenya as a language. When you empower certain social customs with a kind of righteous and regulatory authority, right? When you say that there is a way that things ought to be done, people who don't obey those rules are marking themselves out as distinct. They're marking themselves out as outsiders, and that can become a tool of orientation. It can become a means by which we can recenter and refocus a society, and that seems to be a thing that is happening here, is that by occupying this land in the northeast, Cúdaifin, but yes, by extension, all the sons of Feanor, and yes, by extension, all of the Noldor who have returned from Valinor, right? Cúdaifin is exerting a kind of moral superiority because he is able to wield the power of custom against Ale, and that custom is new, right? Look at how he's teasing him. What errand have you, dark elf, in my lands? An urgent matter, perhaps, that keeps one so sun-shy abroad by day? Look at you. You skulk in the darkness in Nan Elmoth beneath the ancient trees of that forest, dark elf. As I said, until very recently, right, 400 years basically at this point, until very recently, all the elves lived in darkness. All the elves lived beneath the stars initially, and then those who didn't go to Valinor were just living under the starlit skies that Varda had provided for them. And that was it. In so short a time, we've seen a forcible reorientation of society to incorporate the sun and light into their own metaphorical structure, their own metaphorical sense of identity, right? It's a very complicated process, which again, Tolkien would have recognized, would have been replicating here through his familiarity with it in real life. Again, we're looking at the ways in which communities and cultures define themselves, protect themselves, enforce themselves, and splinter, ultimately, of course. Guys, that is, believe it or not, going to take us to the end of today's show. I have a hard out in just a couple of minutes. We are not, of course, going to make it through the huge number of slides that I have left over. So I'm not even going to try to tell you that we're going to do something else next week. Next week, the other half of this week's show. How about that? Next week, we're going to return to Gondolin. We're going to have the showdown with Turgon. We're going to have the final fate of Ale, and we're going to set a path for Maeglin in the years to come. And then we're going to meet men. We're going to get the opportunity to talk about the men who crossed the Ered Luin into Beleriand for the first time, and then the other men that crossed the Ered Luin into Beleriand for the second and third time. We're going to talk about where they come from. We're going to talk about Tolkien's strategy in terms of preserving a space for a Catholic-compatible sense of the creation of man within the Legendarium, like something that can sit alongside the Legendarium, and the notion, perhaps, of how Professor Tolkien handles original sin and his own Catholic faith. That is going to do it. Thank you so much for joining me this week here on this unexpected and somewhat ramshackle Sunday show. We will be back on Thursday. I will clarify that. Let me see if I can get just to my dates here as I move forward. We will be looking at... Yes, April 17th, this coming Thursday, we will finish everything up to the end of Chapter 17. We'll just take this as a whole skip week. And then next week, April 24th, we will be looking at Chapter 18 on the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. I'm not going to try and compress everything together because that's just too much. We've held our schedule together as best we can moving forward. After that, after the fall of Fingolfin, we will do Beren and Luthien the following week. And then I think we'll have 7 or 8 additional sessions just to round this out, which will take us to the middle of June, at which point we are going to launch into a 7 or 8 week run at Jane Austen's debut novel, one of the most important Regency texts in the history of the English canon. Just an absolutely phenomenal book. We're going to be looking at Sense and Sensibility over the summer of Sense and Sensibility. How perfect is that? It's going to be a really fun time. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for putting up with a lot of tangents in this week's show. Galadriel Becky, I largely blame and thank you. Thank you, Glorfin David, for being here. Thank you, Karina, for being here briefly at the start of today's show. It was good to have you with us. I will see you all again on Thursday night.